I've got one here. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Oh, hopefully you can all hear me. I feel like quite a lot of pressure after that introduction to hypnotise you all. Hopefully my presentation will appear. Thank you. Nearly there. So I'll just introduce myself for the moment. So I am Vicky Turnbull, so I'm the site manager for Tayside Reserves. So I am based down at Lochleven, or Vane Farm, as a lot of you probably know it. I'm going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of, oh, have I got this right? Going that way. Sorry, maybe not mastered this quite as I had hoped. Oh, there we go. Thank you. So, I'll just try it again. What have I not got on?
It's definitely pointing up there. It's on
Anyway, so I'm going to tell you a bit about the background of the RSPB, a really brief history and overview. A brief history and overview. There we go, perfect. Thank you very much.
Forward.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. There we go. So yeah, just if you don't know too much about the RSPB, I'm just going to really just kind of skim over the big moments in the RSPB's history, and then I'm really going to delve into the bit that's much closer to my heart, which is the reserves, which is what I spend pretty much all of my time thinking about and doing throughout the year. So, sorry, I am actually going to stand at the side and look at the big one. So the RSPB, the kind of, I suppose, the precursor to the RSPB was really kick-started in 1889, and that was due to a lady called Emily Williamson, who started the Plumage League, and that was primarily, I suppose, a sense of displeasure about how a lot of birds were killed just to use their exotic feathers for hats and in fashion. And there was generally a feeling that was very out of date, and there was a push to really get rid of that. And there was quite a collection of, it very much was a collection of other women that were involved. And they really kind of started this Plumage League, and then they teamed up with other organisations that had similar thoughts about how not just birds but other animals were really killed for fashion, and that was very much what kick-started the RSPB. And then I think it wasn't until about 1905 that we really got the Royal Charter, so that was when the actual RSPB kick-started. And that was really what spiraled since then. So it became a huge push to really get the backing of a lot of people. So there was very much the fashion element that started it, but actually just the sense that actually we should really be promoting and supporting and preserving the wildlife that we have. And then by the 1930, that was when the RSPB bought its first reserve, and that was Romley Marsh down in Kent. And since then, we've really just kind of grown and grown and grown. And it's very much a membership organisation. So by 1969, which obviously was quite a long time after the Plumage League was started, but it very much reached 50,000 members by that point. So obviously there was other priorities in the years before that. So actually to reach 50,000 members by 1969, it really showed the strength of the will and the support within the UK for people that really love their wildlife. And then by 1997, the next real milestone was 1 million members, and we're now sitting at 1.2 million members. And that kind of rises and falls, as you know, as people's will and preferences change, but we're staying pretty stable. So in terms of the population of the RSPB, 1.2 million is really good for the RSPB and shows a huge amount of financial backing as well as will and support for what we're trying to achieve. So I'm going to give you a little bit an idea of the range of work. So I'm very much reserve based. So what I do is quite practical and hands-on and dealing with stuff on the ground, but actually the RSPB covers a huge range of other work areas, and these are just a few actually. So education, so that's a big part of what the RSPB does, and certainly on reserve and down at Loch Leven we have, you know, everybody from, you know, 1-year-old babies being brought to the reserve just to do a little bit of hands-on activities, to university students and adults. Huge range. Understand what we're doing on the reserve, as well as actually really getting involved in quite a lot of the work we do. And it's quite cyclical. Our education programme is under review in terms of kind of school children, but at various points about getting children out of onto reserves, kind of out of their usual environment, and then you know, as that gets more and more difficult, you know, costs change, buses are more expensive to get kids to reserves. There's actually, you know, it can kind of revert to actually going to where the kids are, going to where the communities are. So research, the RSPB is very much a science-led organisation, and probably you'll have seen on the news at various points that we have, you know, stories out there about seabird tracking, or looking at on birds of prey and other. Is my microphone disappearing at points here?
It seems to be coming and going.
Oh, sorry, is this going to be really noisy when I take that off? 50 volunteers, and that's helping with everything from admin to helping in the cafe to basically getting their hands dirty. Most of my volunteers, it's all about being outside and getting their hands dirty. So, and for the most part, they love it, but sometimes they want to go home early. So make of that what you will. We have a lot of local groups as well. So these are groups that obviously support the RSPB, often members groups, and they do everything from advocacy to supporting and promoting the RSPB and generating income as well. So they're quite often, you might see them representing the RSPB at, agricultural shows and various things. So they're really great advocates for the RSPB, and I think Dundee is the nearest local group. I think there maybe used to be one in Perth or Tayside, but I think that disappeared a wee while ago. And as I said before, 1.2 million members. So there's obviously the financial benefits that come with having that amount of support, but it's also, when we run campaigns, it's really important to have that amount of will behind us. And, and we can say to the government, actually, this is really important, and all our members support this, and it's a huge amount of backing for any of the things that we're trying to push through, and it's fantastic that we have that. Okay, so we do a lot of stuff, we have a lot of people, but actually money's quite important as well. So this is just a few of the areas of where we get our income, because I think there's certainly some things in there that were probably not really on my radar before I started working for the RSPB. So fundraising, so that's everything from selling pin badges, which I have a lovely box here if anybody would like to buy pin badges later, and running events, anything that just helps to, I suppose quite often it's about engaging people, getting our message across, but also generating income as well. So I've talked about membership a few times, but that is really where we get the bulk of our income from. Shops and cafes, so if anybody's been down to Lochleven, obviously we have a shop and a cafe there, and it's very much kind of sites like Lochleven that help to generate income, that help to keep my other reserves going. So I'm going to talk about Lochleven, Loch of Kinnordy and the Tay Reed bed, so they're my reserves, which I'll touch on very soon. But there's less scope for generating income on those reserves. So it's really kind of the bigger sites that you need to kind of drive that forward to help prop up the rest. Grants, so quite often that is money that we can apply for, but it's often for a very specific project that we want to do. So whether it's refurbing the visitor centre or enhancing the wetland, it's quite for very discrete projects. Legacies, so that is ultimately people leaving us money in their wills, and quite often that can be, it just goes into the general pot that keeps the RSPB going, but quite often it can be that people, if they have a particular connection with a reserve, then they'll leave money for a reserve or a particular, again, a particular project, a particular thing that they were interested in. And partnerships as well, so I have to say, I did this similar talk 2 weeks ago, and I realised that all of the partnership logos that I had up on the slide were out of date. So I did a quick update. So the co-op, so I think that's to do with biodegradable bags. So they gave us some money for that. Famous Grouse, I think that has been going on for about 15 years, that partnership. So and at other points, it's been to, they've given us money, and that's actually gone into help supporting some of the work that we do on black grouse. So quite often for a partner, it's got a very specific link that they want the money to go to. And then I have to say, I'd never heard of Omaze until very recently, that somehow you give away a really expensive house, which I don't really understand how that's a good money-making model. But that raised an awful lot of money for the RSPB, and that seems like quite a new stream for us. That was really exciting. So on to reserves. So I realise that map's a little bit faded on that slide, but it'll give you an idea of just how many reserves that we have, although I did realise that the top of Shetland was cut off, so apologies for anybody who is from Shetland. So across the RSPB, we currently have 222 reserves. which is over 158,000 hectares. Obviously, see, it's quite weighted to, because the south of England, well, I suppose mid to south of England, but we do have quite a lot of reserves up in Scotland. So it's very much about a range of habitats and species. And in terms of, I suppose, when the RSPB takes on a reserve, well, unless a bit of land has been gifted to us, we're quite targeted about what we want. We don't want any old bit of land. You know, it's actually, is there a particular habitat or a particular species that needs protection there? Because, you know, we are a charity, we have limited resources, so actually we really need to put our money where it's going to make the biggest difference. And each of those reserves will have, you know, a 5-year management plan, a 10-year management plan, and that is very much targeted at, you know, what is special about this reserve, what needs protection, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, and then you pretty much get your work plan and you work to that for the next 5 or 10 years. So each of my reserves has that. And there are various management models, so as I said earlier, so we don't own all of those reserves, so I know the RSPB, you know, it's a very big, you know, has a very big land holding, but actually quite a lot of the reserves, we don't own that land, we maybe have management agreements or leases, so, and it's really quite a mixed bag. Certainly even within my 3 reserves, it's various kind of different management models. So moving to Scotland, so we have over 60 reserves, and we have the 2 biggest RSPB reserves in Scotland. So up on the top of the slide there is Forcenard in the Flow Country, which is a mind-boggling site, and then we've got Abernethy Forest in the Cairngorms. So we very much kind of, I suppose we work maybe at a slightly different scale at some of the reserves that we have up in Scotland. We just, you know, depending on the nature of the landscape, we just have a little bit more land to play with and a lot less people, which is a nice bonus, I have to say. And then, I don't know, does it have a pointer on it? Oh, it does. So, yes, so obviously, everybody knows where Tayside is, but my 3 reserves are just kind of down here. So there's not actually loads of reserves on the east coast of Scotland. There's kind of Strathbeg up in Grampian, but there's quite a lot of seabird sites as well, which again, you know, the management requirements for seabird sites is very different. So, but I manage 3 wetland sites. So we've got Loch of Kinnordy up near Kirriemuir, Tay Reed Beds. It's quite a big site, but towards Errol, and then Vane Farm or Loch Leven, just on the south side of Loch Leven. So I'm going to do a whistle-stop tour of each reserve. So I'm just going to, you know, I could talk at you for a very long time. So I won't. So I'll just skim over, and then if you've got any particular questions, then you could just shout at me at the end. So Loch of Kinnordy. Can I ask, just out of interest, how many people have been to Kinnordy Reserve? Okay, so a few. Of course, Pete, yes. So that's good. So yeah, so it's really, I always think of it as a very special place. So I've been in the RSPB for 15 years, and I've been managing Kinnordy for about, I don't know, 12 or 13, it's a bit of a blur. So I didn't originally have this reserve as part of my suite, but it has been an RSPB reserve since 1976. So it's been around a wee while. And it's very much, it's a very unique site, I would say. So it's actually, do I have? No, that's not a good picture. So what it is it's essentially, it's a loch with a whole range of habitats. So it's a sump for the surrounding landscape. So there very much is a loch in the middle, but you've got fen at one end, you've got quite a large reed bed, which is expanding, and you've got wet woodland at the other end as well. It's a very flat system. So it kind of, the water comes in, I suppose, well, it's mostly seepage from the farmland all around, and then it flows out at the east end and goes down through Kirriemuir. So, but it's a really interesting little reserve, surprisingly inaccessible, mainly because if you walk out onto some of the land, you just fall through up to your armpits. So it looks like land, but there's quite a lot of the fen is, well, it's floating fen, so it's like walking on a giant vegetated waterbed. And I've definitely made the mistake thinking, oh, it's solid, when it's not, and then you have to drag yourself out, which is not very, it's not a very glamorous look, I have to say. But yeah, so it's a very interesting site, and it's got quite an interesting history as well. So although it is a natural loch, and it's a natural loch system because all of the land around it does drain in, the loch was drained in the 18th century, and that was to harvest marl. So they drained, they got rid of all the water, and they harvested the marl, so this kind of clay-rich mineral from the bottom of the loch. They took that all out, and that was used as fertilizer, and then ultimately the loch filled in. So this is, this is not far off really, the size and the shape of the loch at the moment, except that it's, it's got harder boundaries now, I suppose, as field margins have become a lot more established. But when it did fill in, so I think this map is from the 1860s. So obviously once it filled back in, once they drained it, it just kind of naturally filled back in, and it just became marsh. So if you saw the loch now, you would find this very hard to believe, but when it was marsh, there was these causeways that were built across the reserve, and they were just tracks to get to the farms on the north side. So some of them are still in existence, and I have to say, if the water level is low, and you're kind of moving around the site in the canoe, sometimes your paddle does still hit these old causeways that are buried under the surface. But for the most part, it doesn't look anything like that anymore. It's a very wild-looking landscape, and a little bit impenetrable, I have to say. So, but when the loch was lowered, so this log boat was found in the loch, which is quite interesting. I would never have expected to find a log boat in there. So this is actually in storage in Dundee, and I did go and see it, and it's, if you just found it, you wouldn't necessarily know it was a log boat, but it is a very old, twisted bit of wood now, but still impressive nonetheless. And they did also, so when it was drained, so the only thing is, I don't know how, when they drained it, I don't know how much water they drained off the system, but there is, it's called a crannog, and you kind of see it on the OS maps as a crannog, but I think it's more of our archaeologist said it's more of a raised structure with lake dwellings, so it's quite a large mound, and she thinks there would have been smaller wooden buildings built within it, rather than what you kind of expect when you think of a crannog at the Crannog Centre. And also an auroch skull was excavated from the loch as well. So although I kind of think of it as just a bit of a loch that's been drained and messed about with a bit, actually, a lot of people have been using this site for a very long time, which is quite nice that even back in the 80s, it's not changed massively. So in terms of the species that we have, so obviously I said we've got a range of habitats there, and obviously by having a range of habitats, you end up with a range of species. So I very much kind of focused on, I suppose, mostly birds, but there are some interesting plants there as well, interesting lichen, again, on just some of the trees particularly. We've got really nice coral root orchid as well, which every year we go hunting for, but again, it's very dependent on water levels. So, but these are kind of the staples, I suppose, for the reserve. So we've got marsh harrier up there, so we've got a pair that breeds there every year. So if anybody's a photographer here and you want to get really beautiful photos of marsh harrier, then Kinnordy's the place to be, because they nest right opposite the hide. They do flybys all the time. It's incredible. Black-headed gulls, so they're a species that they've taken a bit of a dip in recent years. So a few decades ago, there used to be 6,000 black-headed gull territories at the loch. So they would nest out on all these bog bean islands out in front of the hides, and apparently you used to be able to hear them from Kerrymuir. The sound of them was so loud, but now, black-headed gulls as a whole, they're not doing that well. Colonies kind of up and shift. So they disappeared altogether for a few years, and now there's maybe 20, 30 pairs back now. So we're hoping to see an increase from them as well. But But the habitat has changed quite a lot. So I said a little bit earlier that the reed bed has expanded. So if you look at old photos versus what we have now, the vegetation has really changed quite a lot. And again, that will push species around. It will suit some species, and it will deter other ones, and they're just not really so interested anymore. So there is less habitat for the black-headed gulls now in terms of nesting, but equally, when the gulls were there, the reed bed wasn't suitable for the marsh harrier. So you win some, you lose some. Lapwing, so they do breed at the reserve, so we kind of, as I said, we've got this floating fen, and that really suits them, but we do have birds breeding there and wintering as well, so we do get lapwing year-round, which is quite nice. We've got ospreys, so ospreys don't actually nest on the reserve, but they nest very close by. So again, if anybody's just a keen photographer, they do just come and they fish right in front of the hide, and it's just incredible. And you can sometimes get birds coming from quite a distance to fish at the loch. So really great views of ospreys from there. And a more recent colonizer, shall we say, is the beaver. So we have had beavers on site since about 2011, and they just kind of, I suppose they just appeared, as they seem to do these days. And to date, we've had 9 different lodges around the reserve. So at the moment, we think it's probably still just the one family, but at various points, they've kind of built lodges at different points, and they've maybe tried on the north edge, and they're like, oh, well, we kind of like it, but I don't know, there's something not quite right, so they build another one here and another one there. And quite often, we just stumble across them. We don't even know they're there. So we did have a contractor in they were looking for scarlet splash, which is a lichen, a very unusual lichen, and there was some old records of it being on site. So they were just moving around in the wet woodland, and then all of a sudden they just came across this massive lodge that was very much enclosed in the woodland, so it wasn't visible from anywhere else. So the beavers have very much taught us to expect the unexpected. And certainly, even actually quite often we update the aerial photos of the loch, so we get a drone to fly over, and then we did spot this little anomaly within the reed bed, and then when we went and had a look, we found this old beaver lodge in the reed bed as well. So quite often we don't know what they're up to until they're already done and dusted, which keeps it quite exciting, I have to say. So as I said, so in terms of the habitats, so we've got the main loch there, we've got quite a lot of fen here, so this is really quite a lot of the waterbed stuff, which not everybody really likes to walk on, but it's kind of fun. The reed bed is expanding here, and then there's quite a lot of wet woodland at the east end of the loch. Over the years, because the fen is, well, everything at Kinnordy is trying to vegetate over, ultimately. So it's a site that's very highly designated, including for its open water feature, and that means that the RSPB has a legal requirement to maintain those features. So it's almost like trying to preserve one moment in time, which is not always easy. So when it was designated, I think the loch had about, 17 hectares of open water. So now we have to try and maintain that same amount of water, give or take. So we basically are fighting every year to stop the loch closing over. So if we didn't do anything, it would all really become fen, and then probably wet woodland, and then it would start to dry out. So quite a lot of our work is about trying to maintain that. But in the meantime, you also have this kind of natural shift of habitat. So as certain bits start to dry out, we are getting more reed bed encroaching on the open water. We do still have kind of areas like open water. So this is Lily Loch. So this is like so it's all part of the same system, because it doesn't look like it, but because we have this floating fen, all of the water is connected under the surface. So although this looks like a very discrete, separate pond, everything is very much connected. And then we've got the wet woodland in here as well, which is, I wouldn't say at any point it's expanding, but the beavers are altering that. So they're obviously going in and they're opening up areas where actually we're probably quite stagnant before. So the beavers are very much they're keeping it quite a lot more dynamic than it would be if it was just us kind of going and managing different bits every year. So, so again, that is quite good to have kind of, I mean, I know beavers are known as like ecosystem engineers, but they very much feel like that at Kinnordy because they're creating these little niches that we wouldn't be able to do by hand otherwise. And in terms of the management, so as there we go. So just back to this one. So you can see very much that this, basically, if it looks rough, it's the reserve. If it looks nice and smooth, it's not the reserve, it's agricultural land. And as I said before, so everything from the surrounding land is really draining into Loch of Kinnordy. And that's obviously how it has been for a very long time. But one of the problems that we have is silt coming in, although we think there's less silt coming in than there used to be, but there are certainly quite high nutrients coming in, and obviously, depending on the time of year and the amount of rainfall, that kind of has peaks and troughs. So at various points, we do have quite a lot of runoff coming into the loch, and that means that all this vegetation growth that we're trying to fight just goes boom. And every summer, we just have a hell of a job trying to manage it. So this machine here is the truck saw, so it basically floats on the surface, and it can either cut or kind of rip out vegetation. So we just had it in again for 10 days last month, and essentially, you know, it's trying to keep the channels open so that we still have this movement of water, because quite a lot of the channels, they try to close up. So although there is this movement of water under the surface, essentially, still having, you know, having the ability to kind of have a bit of a flow throughout the system is really important for us. We only have one control structure on the system, so everything flows west to east, and we have a sluice that actually during the spring we try to maintain water levels for breeding birds, so there's not this massive fluctuation. And in theory, in the autumn in the past, we would take those boards out, allow the system to flush, and that would help kind of clear some of the nutrients. But actually, you put beavers into a system, and they're having none of that, I have to say. They just want to keep the water levels where they want to keep them, and if they can do that, they'll bump them up a little bit higher. So, yes, so our management is slightly hampered by the beavers in some way, because also at various times it's useful to dry out the site a little bit more to be able to get in with machinery, but because the beavers like to maintain a certain water level, and there is really only one outflow, which is this one here, and that is where the beavers like to dam, because they've got it sussed. They've figured everything goes through this one channel, that's where we need to dam, and yeah, and at various points they've had 6 dams between the loch and Kerrymuir that we've had to go and take out because the water has just become too high, the paths have been flooded, and it just creates various problems. So you can't probably see it very well in this photo, so it does look like a dam, and it is because it's where the beavers do dam, but you can just see a bit of a pipe sticking through here. It's just a little half round under the surface, and that is a beaver deceiver, or a flow control device, if you want the technical name. And ultimately, what you do is, if you want to maintain some level of control on the system, which we do, because also all the neighbouring farms around start to go into panic mode because all of their fields drains get blocked if the water levels are too high, and it just creates various issues. So the times of year where we can intervene, we do some dam removal, but in the meantime, we have an area where they like to dam. What we do is we dismantle part of the dam and we put a pipe through. So this pipe was originally 12 metres, and then just this year we added another 9 metres onto it. So it runs from below the dam all the way back, and then there's a huge cage at the end, and that just means that the water can still flow through the system. There's a dam still in place, so the beavers think, oh, it's fine everybody, our dam still works, we don't need to do anything, we can turn around and go back to sleep. But actually the water is still just flowing, but under the surface. But the big cage basically stops them blocking that pipe, which they do very, very well. And the reason why we had to extend the pipe this year was because they just, although it was it's a big cage, but they just started absolutely blocking it. So they covered the cage in mud and sticks, and hardly any water was getting through. So we had to adapt yet again, and then we're always just waiting for them to come up with another idea, because it happens all the time. We're lulled into a false sense of security, and then they find a new way to mess with us, basically. And then this other photo up the top. So as I said, so all these nutrients coming in, we end up with quite a lot of vegetation in areas that we don't necessarily want a forest of vegetation, or we end up with essentially the wrong type of vegetation. So in this area up the top, it's a bit of a forest of bulrushes. We've cleared quite a lot, so this is a trial for different methods. So what we've been trying to do is really figure out the best way to get rid of some of these invasive species. So this is an area that used to be covered in scrub, and it was all removed, and then because of the nutrients coming in, and they're not shaded out, it just means that all of this typha or bulrush is just absolutely exploded. So so it is just an absolute jungle. But I have to say, we have slightly given up on it, because until we can stop the nutrients coming in, we're not really solving. It's something that we're looking at longer term, is can we work with other landowners in the catchment to try and alleviate the problem. And I have to say, so in the last month or so we've had Andy Goldsworthy coming in. So I have to say, I didn't really know very much about it, but he's an artist who is going to do an exhibition in Edinburgh next summer on Princes Street, and he wanted loads of bulrush to hang from the ceiling in the gallery for his exhibition. So he was more than welcome to take everything he could. So he's actually coming back this week, because unfortunately we spent a whole day and we didn't get enough. So we have to do that again. And just to say, so Kinnordy, because of all the silt coming in, it means that actually the loch isn't very deep. So, and that's part of the problem, that actually when it does get warm and you have nutrients coming in, it just reaches the tipping point quite quickly, and that's when we get loads of vegetation growth. But obviously it means that when it does freeze over like it did last week, or it does get really cold, the loch freezes over really quite quickly. So this is just a couple of photos from last Thursday. I was surprised at how thick the ice was. There was still some open water, so the wildfowl was still able to still kind of stay there and feed, but actually having quite a shallow loch in the system kind of creates other problems as well. So it means that, a lot of winters the birds and the other wildlife have to shift elsewhere. Sorry, I realise, how am I doing for time actually? Oh, that's fine. Sorry, I realise I just keep blabbing on, that's the problem. Excuse me, so the Tay reed beds. So this is the west end of our bit of the Tay reed beds. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with the reed beds. Yeah, it's a little bit of a hidden gem, really. You can drive kind of between Perth and Dundee, and you never really see it. You never really know it's there, and a lot of people have no idea it exists. But it's about 410 hectares of reed bed on the north of the River Tay. So there are some islands. So I think that's just the side of Mugdrum there. There's these incredible bits out in the river called like the Shura's Death Bank and things like that. So incredible names. And there is a little bit of reed on the south side as well. But all of the RSPB work is on the north side. So the reed bed stretches for about 11 miles along the north edge of the river. Some bits are really wide. Some bits there's not very much between the bank and the river. And the RSPB manages about half of the reed bed. So we kind of have three different chunks, I suppose, or three different compartments. And apart from this kind of exception, which is owned by the Crown Estate, at various other points, so the farm that owns the land at the top of the bank, they then own that bit of reed bed as well. So you have lots of different landowners at various points along the reed beds. So we don't own any of this reserve. And it's a relatively new reserve for us, so the RSPB has been only involved since 2005, and that was it was managed commercially since the 70s. Yeah, so it was managed commercially since the 70s, but then around about kind of the early 2000s, it became really commercially unviable. So Graham, who was managing it at that point, so it was obviously been a very profitable business for a long time, but the cheaper reed imports from abroad, from Turkey and China, were basically mean it wasn't really financially viable. And because of that, Graham then was like, well, I'm going to wind down the business. But because of the management that he had done, and just by doing any management within the reed bed, it had taken what was quite a stagnant, unproductive bit of land in terms of ecologically speaking, and really opened up areas. You get new growth coming in. You get these kind of little wet bits just from machinery going back and forwards. You get new growth. It makes it easy for birds to find nesting locations and areas to forage as well. So just by having some management in there, it meant that beardy tits had turned up there in the 90s. So they'd kind of colonized really on the back of the management. And that meant that, you know, when we kind of heard that the Graham was going to wind down the business, we didn't want to see that management stop, because that actually means that the reed bed would revert. Some of it might actually scrub over and dry out, and it would just be less productive, and it wouldn't be suitable for the species anymore, and actually they would most likely disappear. So that's really when the RSPB stepped in, and we've kind of maintained some of that management since. So just to go back a little step to the history. So unfortunately, I didn't do the perfect overlap of the map and the aerial. So the reed beds were initially established a few hundred years ago to protect the north bank of the River Tay from erosion. So it's quite a few bits. It's quite a high bank, but essentially there must have been this real concern that actually the force of the river was eroding the bank, and something needed to be done. So you can see on the OS map here, so we've got these breakwaters at various points, and if you look at the OS map, there's a huge stretch of them kind of going along. And these were just big stone dikes that were built from the bank out into the river, and the areas between the dikes were allowed to silt up, and then that's really when the reed bed was established. I mean, I'm unsure whether there was already some reed there that was then allowed to stretch out into the river, or whether it was it was encouraged by planting reed within it. But either way, the result is, you can kind of see in this bit here, so there's quite a big bay, I suppose, here, and that is really this bay here. So this whole chunk is reed bed, whereas actually on here it's kind of river. And then there's other structures in there as well. So this bit at Port Allen. So the RSPB doesn't manage that, but that is, that's a couple of sections that have been cut off with the seawall. I think at some point the water was pumped out and they were used for agricultural land, and actually over time they're kind of wetted back up. And just even in the last winter, this seawall breached with kind of the stormy weather last winter. So it was quite a discrete pool that was, had a fairly static water level, and now it's become a tidal system as well. So I haven't been down for a wee while, but again, there'll be some winners and losers out of that. So in terms of the species that we're managing for, so we've got 3 priority species at the reed bed. So we've got water rail, beardy tit, and marsh harrier. So the water rail, very rarely seen, but often heard, the sound of the squealing pig. It's quite a haunting, creepy sound at times. But they're always kind of skulking around, and they really like the wet margins of the reed bed. Quite often where the reed bed meets the bank, it's quite there's kind of like these little temporary pools that are just kind of sitting in under the trees almost. So they really like them, and we did a full site survey last year. There's about 150 territories of water rail down at the reed bed. So I'll give you a really good chat if you want to hear them, or maybe see them. Then the reed bed is a really great place to go. So beardy tits, so there's a beautiful photo of a male up here with its moustache. So they're very much reed bed specialists. And it's very hard to know for sure how many pairs of beardy tits that we have on the reserve, or throughout even the reed bed. So it's probably about 200 pairs. So probably, you always have to caveat things with probably, the biggest population in the UK. So there's obviously other kind of famous sites, but just because of the absolute scale of the Tay reed beds, which is the largest continuous reed bed in the UK, it's just able to support an absolute huge population. And there are species that is very much kind of boom and bust, so they can crash if they have a bad year and really recover quite quickly, which again also makes it quite hard to kind of really get a handle on population sizes. But they're very much kind of the species that we have in mind when we're managing. So we manage kind of these open blocks and leave old reed nearby. So they nest in the old reed, and then they can have these really open areas to find insects in the springs for feeding their chicks. So it's this kind of combination and a mosaic that we're really trying to achieve. And then the marsh harriers, which I have to say are very scruffy and a little bit ugly when they're young, but they nest within the reed bed. So they like the old unmanaged bits of reed bed, and they build nest platforms kind of waist high. They kind of chuck in reed and sticks and various things. And then, so I think this year across the reed bed there were 6 pairs nested there, kind of on and off reserve. And well, 4 is the maximum chicks that they can have, but there's the Tay ringing group, so they go out and they've been ringing the chicks for quite a few years, and that's just to really get a handle on, you know, where the bird's ending up when they leave the Tay, because actually not that many of them have been found to come back. So, so that's really the 3 species that we very much kind of got our eye on. And habitats, it's all reed bed. It's all the same, which I have to say makes it kind of nice and easy. You don't have to think about it too much. We do have, strangely, 500 hectares of mud out in the river, but needless to say that doesn't take a lot of management. It just does what it does. It just kind of came with a bit of the land that we manage. So we're very much just focused on one habitat, but it's surprising how difficult that still is. So in terms of the management, so this is really, this is the older machine. So when I talked about Graham, who managed it commercially, this is Graham cutting on his Sega. So we don't manage all of the reed bed for thatch, but because it's really such, you know, it's quite a cultural part of the reserve, and that history of the reserve, and there is still a demand for Scottish thatch. So the RSPB came in, and although we don't do it on such a big scale, we didn't want to see the thatch operation come to an end. So we do still manage for thatch. And this is essentially kind of what it looks like. So this is an older photo. So this is really what Graham used to cut. So he used to just basically start at one end and cut as far as he could. So there's these big ditches within the reed bed, and as I said, there's these dikes as well. So they would kind of be the limiting factor. So he would just kind of start at one end and go to the other, and ultimately you create these bales. So we actually do much smaller blocks now, and that's because through kind of various RSPB projects and other research, it's really determined that the edge effect is quite important. So it's having the old reed next to the new reed that's quite that is really useful for for beardy tit. So that's kind of one of the key elements that they're looking for, is really having this mixture of a mixture of structures and diversity where we can create it. So we don't need these huge long blocks that Graham made. So if you're there anytime soon, there's a lot of like little square blocks that we've kind of squeezed in between dikes as well. So it's similar but different. And the kind of the green areas, that's the new growth coming through. So that's the areas that have been cut. And then after it's cut, so this is essentially a bale. So a bale is 80 bunches, which is, I don't know, about that size. And one bunch will do a square foot on a roof. So you can get 80 square feet out of one of those. So this is it kind of all processed. So it looks quite scruffy when it comes off the bed, and then you need to reprocess it. And that gets rid of any bent stems, any broken stems, the leaf as well. So it doesn't get harvested until after it's frosted, and that allows the leaf to drop off. And that means you're not kind of removing loads of debris off of the reed bed. And then it all gets kind of primped and preened and turned into that, and then we sell it to thatchers, or that's the plan. So if anybody has a thatched roof, please come and speak to me afterwards, because I could sell you some thatch. I've I've got a shed full, and I'm about to start harvesting again. So one of the people in the last few years that have bought thatch from us is the new Crannog Centre. So the old Crannog on the south side of the loch, that was thatched with tayreed, and now actually in the new visitor centre, which I'm actually going to go and see tomorrow, they've used quite a lot of tayreed as well. So it's nice to kind of, it's nice to see it used locally. So in the last few years, I've kind of shipped it to Tiree and the Western Isles as well. So actually having it kind of used in the local landscape is quite nice. And in other areas of the reed bed, so the problem with the thatch is that you have to cut the same bit every year. So all thatch is single wale, so that's 1 year's worth of growth. So that means you're very much tied to, okay, we have to cut this same block time and time again. But actually what we want throughout the reed beds is a bit more diversity. So we want more of a mosaic, different age structures, because it kind of creates these different ecological niches which benefit different species. So in other areas, we just go in and we flail. So we just chop the material and we leave it on the bed. And that means we can chop and change, and we can cut different blocks every year. So we kind of focus the thatch operation on one section at Tay Lodge, which is just south of Errol, and then there's kind of bits either side that we mix things up quite a lot more. All right, on to Loch Leven. So I'll just be very quick because I think I've talked too much. So this is the reserve at Loch Leven. It used to be Vane Farm. And this is an aerial from a few years ago, actually, because we're still doing our new underpass, I think. But this encompasses quite a lot of the reserve. So the loch itself is managed, so it's privately owned, and it's managed by Nature Scot as part of the NNR. So our reserve is joined the NNR in the 90s, the National Nature Reserve. So we have about 315 hectares down at Loch Leven, and that is a mix of, I suppose, the open pools down here. There's wet grassland as well, and the bit that you can't see, which will be in later slides, is kind of the bit where the person taking the photo is from. So up on the hill, so we've got woodland and heathland up above. So it's quite a nice mix, but our boundary is, despite our name change to RSPB Loch Leven, we don't manage the loch, we just manage up to the loch shore. But we've been there since 1967, so we own most of the reserve. There's a little bit along the loch shore that we don't own, and that's still owned by the people that own the loch, but we manage it as if it's part of the reserve. So in terms of the history, so Loch Leven used to be a lot bigger. So in the 1830s, Loch Leven was lowered by about 1.5 meters, and that meant that the loch shrunk by about a quarter, and obviously the loch level was a lot lower. That was when they straightened the River Leven, or, well, it's known as the Cut now, and they put the sluice house in as well. So it's a natural loch, but it's artificially controlled by the sluice house. So that means that quite a lot of our reserve, before it was drained, would have been probably, some of it would have been underwater year-round, other bits would have been kind of seasonally wet, depending on rainfall. And then, so we have this photo in stock, but I don't have a year, but I think it was before we were involved, so it would be pre-67. And you can see that obviously, you know, it's quite heavily worked. There's quite a lot of small fields, quite a lot of field boundaries. It certainly looks very dry. There's little pockets of trees. And this is what it is now. So we've really kind of opened it up. So we don't want lots of little fields. And we've tried to wet it up. You can see up on the hill here that there's very few trees up here, whereas we actually took all of the grazing off. It was quite heavily grazed when we took it on, so there wasn't a woodland up there. And we kind of stripped that back and have allowed the woodland to expand. Excuse me, we're also regularly still digging out old field drains. So you can imagine, you know, this was obviously underwater or probably very wet. So when the loch level dropped, they drained the life out of it. You know, they just well, that's a terrible term, but they drained a lot. They put in a lot of field drains at various levels because we found quite a lot of them. And at some points you get like 3 different layers of clay pipes buried under the ground. So over the years we've kind of been going and stripping those out. And even just in the last few months, over in the west of the reserve, so over here, which not surprisingly looks quite dry, we've been digging down to break through some of those field drains and clear things out. So some of the management for, so lapwing, that's our number one. So our whole year is almost built around managing the reserve for breeding lapwing. So it's a species that's really struggling, it's in decline. So I think the population has dropped by about half since the 60s, and it doesn't, it's going to take quite a lot to bring it back to what it used to be. So a lot of our management is built around managing the vegetation, managing the water levels, just to get it right for lapwing in the spring. And that is really about having an open landscape as well as having all these muddy margins so that when there's lapwing chicks on the go in the spring, that they've kind of got really easy food availability. And we've got red shank as well, so we've got other lowland wet grassland waders, so we do have curlew as well, and oystercatcher and snipe. So it tends to be that whatever we do for the lapwing, it also benefits the other species that are that thrive in similar habitats. And again, some of those species as well, we have other flocks that come in the winter. So although we're very much focused around breeding habitat, a lot of what we do has kind of wider benefits for other species as well as, kind of throughout the year as well. So I've just kind of taken a few species really, to be honest, because actually, if anybody's been down to Loch Leven, the amount of species that kind of come and go throughout the year, and it is phenomenal. But these are kind of some of the biggies that we talk about and we think about all the time. So the pink-footed geese as well. So Loch Leven is an internationally important site for wintering wildfowl, and that includes pink-footed geese. So earlier on this year, we had about 17,000 pinkies. On the last count a couple of weeks ago, that had dropped to just under 7,000. And that is kind of the usual fluctuation that we would expect. But the pinkies are a big draw in the autumn for people. So, quite often we get people phoning up and saying, when can we see the geese? Because they're just a phenomenal sight. But they're quite an iconic species, really, for Loch Leven. And the red squirrel down there in the corner, so that's quite a success story for us. So we didn't really used to get red squirrels. When I started down at the reserve, you get the occasional grey, but then it really switched. We very, very rarely see a grey, but actually red squirrels they put on a phenomenal show. So you can go out just behind the visitor centre and you'll get 6 squirrels, especially at the moment, and they're all running around burying food. And so they're something that obviously they're an absolute people pleaser, but also just really nice to see a species kind of bounce back so well. And we do have a camera on one of our squirrel feeders that you can watch on YouTube. And we do get people that sit on there what feels like 24 hours a day, because you see comments from like 3:30 in the morning and various things like that. But it's really interesting because one of the people that's been sitting watching it really early hours, they picked up pine marten as well, which we didn't know we had on the reserve. So that also might be working in the favour of the red squirrels, keeping the greys away by having pine martens. So because they certainly seem to be on the rise as well. And it's worth saying, although this is just a few of the species that I've picked, I suppose because that's what we think about on the reserve, whereas actually because we've got our chunk of land, we've got Loch Leven, but the amount of wildfowl that go back and forwards between the two areas is phenomenal. So although we're not specifically managing as much for wildfowl, there's just this kind of constant movement that we have to kind of be conscious of, and managing the water levels accordingly. So just in terms of the habitats, so just a quick fly. So when I talk about the wetlands, not sure what to do with that. Oh. Where did that come from? Oh, that was a live one? Oh, well, there you go. How's that for technology? I have to say, because there's a screen in the visitor centre as well with it on, and when I walked through the other day, there was jays on it. And I was like, I didn't know we had jays coming to the squirrel feeder. So, see, everybody loves red squirrels, And occasionally you do see them like chase people. People watching it on YouTube, they do email us and they phone us up from like the south of England to say, "Do you know your squirrel feeder's empty?" And like people are super invested in our squirrels now. So, God, that one's just eating loads. Thank you very much for that. Of the habitats. Sorry, I don't know what to do about my fuzzy speaker, but I'll just keep going. So we've got our wetlands and our our wet grassland on the edge of the loch. So up on the hill behind the visitor centre. Is that any better? So we've got the woodlands. Okay, thank you. So we've got the woodland up behind the visitor centre, and that peters out into heathland as well, up on the top. And then we've got our butterfly, our bumblebee meadow that is also good for butterflies, down on the edge of the wetland as well. So we have a mix of species, mixture of habitats. Some are very low intervention, so in terms of up on the hill, we pretty much let it do its own thing. We hope that the woodland will expand. Strangely, we also hope that the heathland will expand, and you can't have both, so at some point we'll need to decide what is the highest priority. The bumblebee meadow is quite low intervention as well, which is nice, which means that we basically spend all of our time on the wetland, just trying to get that right. I think this is maybe my last slide. So in terms of the management, so I have to say wet grassland is incredibly labour intensive. So if you want to manage for lapwing and other similar species, it takes a lot of work and a lot of time, but it's worth it. So in terms of some of the management we're doing, I said on a previous slide that we were doing quite a lot of work over in the west. We're breaking down old field drains. So this is what this was. So this was only a couple of months ago. And this was, we have quite a big area of land, which, because all the soil is very sandy, everything is very free draining. And then you add old field drains into that, and that kind of compounds that problem. So we did various test digs in the last couple of years, and we found that actually a lot of the field drains, all these little short sections of clay pipe, they're all still flowing very well. So what we're going to try and do is, so we've dug all the way through from one side of the field to the other and then up the burn edge, and that's hopefully cutting off quite a lot of the pipes, although the contractor didn't actually find as many as we'd expected. So this was kind of the wettest bit, so you can't really see in the photo, but there was quite a congregation of field drains here. And then we've kind of put some bunds in, and hopefully we're able to actually kind of build up some of the water levels and hold it a little bit longer. We don't have any rivers or streams really flowing into the reserve. We're very much reliant on rainfall, and that means we have to try and in the winter when it rains, if it really rains at all, which doesn't feel like it has at the moment, we need to really hold on to as much of that water as possible. And so we use a series of bunds or ditches or sluice structures as well, with kind of pipes that we can angle and adjust water levels. So we basically try to hold on to as much of that over the winter as possible and redistribute that over the spring, when it's really more crucial for breeding waders and other species as well that are reliant on stable water levels. So we do a little bit of digging when we can, but obviously you can't go digging all the time. So actually you need to find other ways to manage your land. So you can see just up here, so we've got a few Highland cattle. So we don't have the Highland cattle anymore, but we've got somebody else's very lovely cattle. But grazing is quite a lot about what we do. So water levels are absolutely key, but the amount of actual control that we have on the reserve is quite minimal. So we kind of hold the water where we can and distribute it, again, where we have structures in place. But the other really important thing that we do is managing the vegetation. So we do that mechanically, as you can see here, and then also using cows. So we can't use mechanical methods during the breeding season, or even actually in the winter when the geese come back. We try to minimize all disturbance. So the geese have kind of arrived from Iceland and Greenland. They're a bit knackered. They need to refuel, so we don't want to go out there and flush them. So we get on and we use brush cutters, or this is a soft track machine as well, so it's a tracked vehicle, it can go onto soft ground. So we use kind of bits of kit where we can, but most of the time we're very much reliant on sheep and cattle to do a lot of the work for us. So, so we have stock on site year round. They hopefully just keep things ticking over. So unfortunately, once the vegetation gets so far and it gets a bit dense and a bit rank, they don't really want to eat it, not surprisingly enough. So that's when we really have to do mechanical methods. And really we're trying to keep the landscape as open as possible. So when you're managing for lapwing, they like nice flat ground, nice and open, so that when they're in their little shallow nest and incubating for 4 weeks, they want to be able to see predators coming. So they need this really open landscape around them. So that's why we try to kind of maintain these open areas as much as possible. So that means that you get a machine like this in and it can cut all this horrible rush away, and then it takes it off, so we are kind of stripping the nutrients off as well, which is hopefully reducing the problem. Yeah, so we try to keep things as open as possible, and that in previous years has meant removing a lot of trees as well. So if scrub comes up or if any trees come up, we want to remove them because they're predator perches, and that's the same with fence lines as well. So we're trying to kind of keep quite an open area with good views all around. It works and sometimes it doesn't, I have to say. So in this area here, this was just in the last 2 weeks. So not surprisingly, cattle don't want to eat gorse. I mean, I have to say, I still have the scars from cutting all of this. So we'll use mechanical methods where we can, we'll use the grazing where we can, but sometimes we just need to drag people in and get them on their hands and knees cutting back vegetation because we don't have any other choice as well. So we kind of look at all methods, and actually this area here where there's the gorse, that on the loch edge there used to be a woodland. So although it was designated as transition fen, so it shouldn't have a woodland on it, it was classed as unfavourable condition, and then when we took on the management we removed the trees. But actually ever since then, which was about 15 years ago, we've got kind of all this scrub coming up. So we've got birch, we've got willow, we've got gorse. There's just quite a lot of, there's a big seed bank in there. So, and it's just a bit of an ongoing problem. And it's so wet, apart from at this time of year, for some reason, that we can't really get in with machinery. So quite often the only method is grazing. And then I feel like the sheep and the cattle just laugh at us and say, we're not touching that. So then you just have to get in a lot of volunteers and cut it by hand. So we're never short of work, is what I'm saying. So if anybody wants to come and lend a hand at Lochleven, cut back some gorse, or I don't know, maybe dig a ditch, then please let me know. Yeah, and as I said, so all of our work is within a management plan as well. So it might just seem a little bit random, some of the things we do, but actually it's all quite structured, and we generally know what we should be doing and when we're doing it. So hopefully all that made sense. But thank you very much. Apologies for going a bit over. And
Thank you, John. I'll hand over to David for the Q&A, please.
Don't forget your water.
oh, thank you. Yes, really.
Any questions for Vicky from what I will now think of as the Royal Society for the
Plumage League.
the Royal Society of Beaver Deceivers?
Yes, yeah, beaver deceivers, yeah. Oh, it must have been so comprehensive.
Thank you.
Just a couple of questions. The hides which go around Lochleven, is that under your jurisdiction?
So the hides, at Lochleven or Vane Park, so we've got 3 hides there, so kind of on our wetland trail, but there are other ones that are all managed by Nature Scott around the loch.
Yeah, okay. And is there maybe you did say, is there overhead a main office?
So down at Lochleven there is, yes.
No, but for the whole of the UK, is there overall headquarters for?
So down at the lodge in Bedfordshire. That's our headquarters.
So that coordinates everything together, does it?
In theory. Yes, so some things are done depending on the country, other things are done centrally. So, yeah, so it's quite variable.
Vicky, if you come away from that.
Oh,
speaker
sorry,
then-
I can't. I just keep trying to hide in the corner. So.
Any others?
Somebody you know.
Oh, hopefully it's not a difficult one from Pete.
How successful was the electric fence at keeping land predators off?
How successful? It's variable, I have to say. So just to explain, actually, maybe that's better. So in this area here, so this is our main kind of wader area. Because we do quite intensive lapwing productivity monitoring, so we know what happens really to each nest. And for years, it meant that we were picking up data that indicated that foxes were a problem. And then so we had to prove without a shadow of doubt that foxes were our biggest issue. And then the RSPB has quite a strict vertebrate control policy, so we did manage to get the whole go-ahead to do fox control. But then once you start changing that population, then you end up with badgers moving in. And unfortunately, you can't do anything about the badgers, so they're quite happily living still in the middle of the reserve over here. So just on the edge of our key wader area. So as Pete said, so then we decided, well, we don't have a lot of choice, so we put up an anti-predator fence. So this is a big fence, which is 1.3 meters high, it's 30 centimeters under the ground, and it's got a very powerful kick to it, let me tell you. But the thing that we've not done is fenced along the loch shore. So we have a scare fence that stops the cattle going into the water and adding to the nutrients. Because we didn't want to put a big barrier there, because actually this movement of wildfowl between the loch and the wetland is just really important for us. So we kind of have these open dog legs at either end in the hope that if a fox or a badger walks along and tries to swim around the end of the fence, that actually the dog leg kind of kicks them back and pushes them back in the opposite direction. So in answer to Pete's question, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So actually the very first year with the fence was incredible. We had the highest productivity. We had curlew successfully fledging inside the fence. But we have had breaches at different points, and that's obviously, foxes can swim, badgers can swim, and because the loch is really shallow, so obviously I said, it dropped by 1.5 meters, but actually the average depth is 4 meters. So when it does get really cold for a prolonged period, it ices over quite quickly, and that can mean that because this edge in particular is shallow, so if it ices over, you can get a fox or a badger just walking on the ice and getting around the end of the fence and coming in. So I have to say, we don't know for sure that that's what has happened, but we have had breaches at various points. But I mean, it is slightly the nature of, you manage one predator, you create an opportunity for another predator. So now what we've done is for the most part, we've excluded the foxes, we've excluded the badgers. So that reduces the predator pressure inside the anti-predator fence. So now we're seeing more stoats. So it's just this constant shifting around. So then what we've done is to try and increase the small mammal population of voles. We've put another fence inside the fence to stop the cattle grazing as much, so that we have longer grass, and that will hopefully be better cover for the small mammals, the voles, so that the stoats just eat them instead. So it's just every year it changes, basically. So last year was all right, though.
Thank you, Vicky. It's always amazing, really, when you go to these places and you walk around, and all we see are the superficial sort of things that we look at. To realise the amount of work that goes into maintaining the actual reserves themselves is fantastic, and it's a credit to you and your team and the volunteers. And also, thank you again for coming along this morning. and making it a very interesting talk. I'm sure we've all enjoyed that. I certainly have. Just to remind you that Vicky does have badges here, and if you want to make a donation, please feel free to do so. And I'll just finish off by, this is the last meeting before Christmas, so I'll wish you, maybe you won't be the first to wish you happy Christmas, but enjoy Christmas. I'll see some of you at the Christmas lunch next week. And the next talk, as we know, is in January, and that's on Robbie Burns in Perth. So, as I say, have a safe journey home. Thank you for coming this morning. And thank you, Vicky, for the really interesting talk. It was excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you.